It's Tuesday, February 18th, 2025. My name is Ashton, Ellett, here with another installment of the Senate Staff Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm joined today by Brent Orrell, a graduate of the University of Oregon. He began his career in Washington on the staff of Senator Sam Nunn, eventually rising to the post of Deputy Legislative Director. Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, he served stints working for Senator Dan Coates of Indiana, U.S. Representative Gil Gutnick, thank you, and Senator Brownback of Kansas. He went on to serve in various roles in the U.S. Departments of Labor and Health and Human Services during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Orrell is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, specializing in job training and workforce development, with a special focus on disconnected and disadvantaged populations, as well as the impact of artificial intelligence on skills training and job markets. Mr. Orrell, Brent, thank you so much for taking the time.
You bet.
Looking forward to talking about your time working on Capitol Hill.
You only missed one aspect of my bio, which is that I entered the Georgia delegation through J. Roy Rowland, who was the congressman from Middle Georgia.
That's right. Dr. Rowland.
Dr. Rowland. He was the first person who gave me a job on Capitol Hill.
Really? Okay. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that. Getting that first taste of Potomac fever in the congressman's office. But you're actually a West Coast guy.
Yes.
Grew up in Oregon. Tell me about that.
Well, let's see. I was born on the south coast of Oregon, a little town called Myrtle Point, and my parents, after I was born, moved up to the Portland area, and I grew up basically in one town outside Portland called Sherwood. It was a town of 2,000 people, and high school of 500 students, and a graduating class of 111. So it's small, very small, but close enough to a big city that you had access to those things. And went to the University of Oregon, and I was my entrance into politics was actually working for one of Nunn's best friends, Senator Mark Hatfield. I volunteered on his campaign. And the night before the election, the campaign manager came to me and said, "I don't have your application for your internship." And I said, "What are you talking about? I don't know anything about an internship. What is it?" And so that was actually how I got to DC, was to intern with Mark Hatfield. And but I knew even before I came to DC that I was really interested in this guy from Georgia by the name of Sam Nunn. So he was much on my mind even before I really knew that much about him, actually. Just seeing him on the news and hearing him talk about arms control and U.S.-Soviet relations. I was a Russian East European history major, so that was my policy connect.
That was actually one of my questions. Is, if you plan to go to DC, what's this European history study?
Well, it was great prep actually for a job working in policy because it utilizes almost all the same skills. Got to read, got to think, got to write. So it was really good preparation. I also learned very shortly after I arrived in DC that the field I was interested in was extremely crowded. This was we didn't know it was the tail end of the Cold War, but it was the tail end of the Cold War. And there were a lot of people in DC that wanted to do foreign policy.
Sure.
I was one of them. But I found myself competing with people who had PhDs from Princeton for the same job, answering mail for the Foreign Relations Committee or something. So I had to pivot, and I got picked up by J. Roy Rowland, who he was a circuitous route. A former Mattingly staffer who was a friend of another friend of mine, and that friend connected me to her, and she wrote me letters of introduction around to the Georgia delegation. I had a bunch of interviews. Dr. Rowland needed a computer operator. And if you can imagine what the computers were like in 1987, it was pretty crude stuff.
Federal government computers.
Yeah, yeah. And so I did that, and then I, started answering mail and became in LA. But I was angling for Nunn's office. That's where I wanted to go. And a legislative correspondent job came open. And I went over there and interviewed with Charlie and Julie Abbott, Rob Hall, and a couple of other people, and they offered me the job, and I jumped on it, even though I had to take a pay cut in order to do it. So that's how much I
Because you
wanted
had been
it.
in LA in the house and you were going to the...
No, I was LA or LC, whatever they called me then. But I was going to the Senate, and it was, I think it was regarded as a privilege to work for somebody like Nunn. And so you didn't bargain hard.
Old Georgia tradition of not paying staffers.
Yes, and you particularly didn't bargain with Charlie, because he was the chief of staff and tight as a drum, so.
That's fair.
Yeah.
If he were here, he would agree. So,
Oh, his theory was, I'll treat everybody equally badly, which actually works pretty well. So, because everybody knew they were all in the same boat.
That is certainly a form of equality.
Yeah.
That's one form. So tell me, what policy areas did you have in the House, and then what were you covering in the Senate?
So I actually handled some foreign affairs work for Dr. Rowland. That was when aid to the Contras was really a hot issue, and he was part of a task force to try to figure out how to extract the United States from military aid to the Contras, and so I staffed him on that.
Covered a lot of Boland Amendment.
Yeah, Boland Amendment, and it was former Congressman Bonnier who was kind of the leader for that. Anyway, so that was kind of my introduction. But when I got to Senator Nunn's office, it was really just to fill the job that was open. Answering mail, mainly in I remember transportation. I remember governmental affairs. Senator Nunn was on the government affairs committee, and I remember transportation because we were in the middle of the Eastern Airlines strike, and it was endless telephone calls from people who worked for Eastern, and hearing their complaints about how evil Eastern Airlines was. And then, so did that that was 1987. And I think I did that for maybe a year, and then was promoted to LA.
Oh wow!
Handling some of the same issues, but I also picked up, oddly enough, I picked up judiciary, though I'm not a lawyer. I was replacing Rob Hall when he left, and that was about the time that Bill Clinton had been elected.
Okay.
90. So it was longer than that. It was so it's probably 1990.
Okay.
So I'd done mail for quite a while, and because it was so much fun working for Senator Nunn, it was very low turnover staff. People really stayed a long time. I was there for 7 years, which is a lot in Hill staffer time. So anyway, so I picked up Rob's stuff about the time that Clinton was elected, and the senior member of the president's party in every state, the senior senator in that state from the president's party, has a lot of say over who gets appointed to judicial offices. And that was my introduction really to staffing him, Senator Nunn, on a major project initiative, which was to organize the literally hundreds of applications from people in Georgia who wanted to be marshals or judges or prosecutors.
Were you staffing him direct, or were you reporting directly on
Yeah,
this?
yeah. And I spent an entire summer, probably the summer of '93, must have been, traveling around Georgia, first with Gordon Giffen and who's the Matlock guy? Do you remember?
It's got to be Buddy Darden.
No, it wasn't Buddy Darden. There was this famous lawyer, Charlie Cook. I think it was his name. Is that? No. It's a famous lawyer.
We'll think of it.
Yeah, we'll think of it. Famous lawyer up in North Georgia who the Matlock character was based on. If you've read the novel Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, he was the defense attorney for the protagonist of the story, the guy who was accused of murder.
Sonny's in the book, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a really eclectic crew of some of these really brilliant legal minds that Gordon recruited and convened, and we interviewed we went from hundreds to dozens of candidates for jobs.
Bobby Lee Cook.
That's exactly right, Bobby Lee Cook. And yeah, I spent a whole summer doing that. It was my introduction to Georgia in the summer.
So you had never been?
Not for very
really
long. I'd been down briefly one time with Dr. Rowland, but this was like weeks at a time. And so, and then so we went through that process, all of these interviews. Gordon was leading it. I was kind of like liaising between him and Senator Nunn around this stuff, trying to keep track of all the materials, and then we got around to kind of formulating the list of people that Nunn would interview, and then I went on all of those interviews with him. Again, pretty young still at that point, and it's one of the great things about working on Capitol Hill then. I don't know if it's still the same now, but you get involved in things that you're like, I don't know how I got involved in that, but it was really a great experience. And then was there, alongside that team, kind of putting together what we recommended to President Clinton to fill the vacancies in Georgia.
Did Senator Fowler's staff have any input?
Not Fowler by then.
I guess Fowler would have been out.
He lost in '92.
You're right.
Right. So it was Coverdale, who was
a Republican. So
yes, but the Senate being a different place at that time, he did consult with Coverdale because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't picking people who were an absolute no, somebody who would get hung up in the confirmation process. Anyway, so did that. I advised him on healthcare reform at the beginning of the Clinton administration, which was mildly traumatic. I'll never forget, there was a meeting that I was staffing him out of kind of centrist Democrats who were trying to make up their minds about what they were going to do on health reform, and I just kept telling him, Senator, it isn't going to happen. I mean, I just didn't see that, and we got stopped outside of it going into this meeting, and he by NBC News, and he was like, they asked him what he thought the prognosis was. And he said, I think we are months or years away from healthcare reform. And, he
wasn't wrong.
He was not wrong. He was, if anything, too optimistic. It was decades.
So during that time period, there was changeover with Charlie leaving and going back to Atlanta to work for the Chamber of Commerce, and Bob Hurt coming in from Lindsey Thomas's office, who Lindsey had just retired. What was that changeover like? Because Charlie is has a particular style.
Yeah.
And Bob's style, and Bob's a bit more laid back than Charlie. Still professional, but
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a different. Tell me about the difference in how the office runs based on who the AA or chief of staff is.
Charlie was hands down one of the best managers I've ever worked for. Despite what I said about him being tight with the dollar.
Both things can be true.
He was always there beside you when the hard stuff was happening. He didn't ever throw staff to the wolves. He didn't, he was, he, like Senator Nunn, wanted excellence in what we did. And as long as we were producing that, he was there with us. So, ran a very tight ship because he inherited a real mess, my understanding was, when he got there, in terms of, months and months and months of unanswered mail and, all sorts of problems, and None running into constituents when he was down in the States saying, I wrote you 6 months ago, I haven't heard anything. So he came in and really cleaned that up, and the most stressful day of the week was Thursday because that was the mail report day, and we were all scrambling to try to get everything that was more than a week old out. So very good administrator, very good administrator, sharp political instincts. So he was great. Bob was a very different person, right? He was a press guy. That was his, how he came up. So he was more relaxed, more easygoing, frankly, more of an advocate for the staff in some ways. Very different styles. And I think that, what Charlie established made that job, I think, a lot easier than it would have been for Bob.
That adds a lot. I appreciate you saying that, because that adds a lot of context to a comment that Charlie said yesterday, which was, I asked him, what was he brought in to do? And he said, I was brought in to get the mail out the door.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, that was always, but that adds a lot of context to I guess, with the turnover from Richard Ray and Roland McElroy and those folks leaving there.
Yeah.
He comes in 87.
Yeah.
Now, what about the legislative directors at the time? It sounds like on judicial nominations, you're reporting directly to the senator. But how do you then report to either Julie or Rob?
Yeah, everything ran. When I say report directly, I don't mean that I, would walk into his office unannounced or without Julie or Rocky or Charlie or Bob knowing. I mean, it was that was not the pattern.
Not that kind of office.
Not that kind of reporting, but Julie. Most of my time there was with Julie. Abbott Murphy now, and she was just great to work with, and I keep going back to this, but I think the single most important thing to understand about that office was its commitment to excellence. Senator Nunn was very particular. Total gentleman about it. I never heard the guy raise his voice once in the entire time I worked for him. Total gentleman, but you were expected to really understand the issues that you were covering. And it was a really bad day if you didn't know. Not because he would get mad, he would just start asking questions.
The Socratic method.
The Socratic method. I mean, it was like, we were all. I feel sorry for the people who had to go down to the Senate Governmental Affairs Investigation Subcommittee because, he was the prosecutor. He was asking all of the hard questions, and if you got behind the curve with him on a vote, on a nomination, on anything, you never wanted to have that happen again, and I can only remember it happening once for me. So
all these years later,
it left a very deep impression. So, but he expected us to know, and so we worked really hard, at knowing and understanding, really going as deeply as we could as non-specialists, right? We weren't Armed Services Committee people with, 20 years in the military, or, we were generalists, having to, work on issues that we didn't really know that much about. You were talking earlier about transportation. Another one of those harrowing experiences was the highway, the year that they reauthorized the highway bill that I was handling it. And we were there all night, weekends. It took forever to get through it. And there were so many amendments that you're trying to track. That was why Weil Fowler was there, and so we were coordinating closely with his team. It was a real deal, and we were expected to understand how the funding formulas for highways worked.
And you're not a surface transportation guy.
No, I'm a Russian history major. So anyway.
Well, again, that adds I think it was maybe Roland who said, you were talking earlier about how the constancy of the key staffers, how they stayed, and I think it was Roland who said, it was almost, there was a probationary period, and those who didn't make the cut, Charlie or Roland or Bob would thank you, good luck, but this office isn't for you. Was that your impression of how
that isn't my impression of how staff were handled. The people that I worked with, people like Kathy Quinn, Rocky, the other legislative assistants that I worked with, they were all really, really good people. There was nobody that I can recall anybody said that person needs to go. That while I was there, that didn't happen.
Well, you mentioned Kathy. Kathy still works for
the
Senator.
Yeah.
She did something right. Well, tell me how much. You mentioned the surface transportation highway bill, working with Senator Fowler's staff, so Bob Redding and his folks. How much interaction did you have with the senator's counterpart, be it Senator Fowler or Senator Coverdell's staff?
On issues that were really, like the highway bill, where we had a very Georgia-specific outlook on it. Right. That's all about which state gets how much money, and so I coordinated very closely with Stacey Abrams, who was his one of his legislative assistants, and got to know her really well, and we did a lot of work together. So that was my main experience of coordinating. I don't remember really doing much work at all with Senator Coverdell's staff, it's sort of a rule of thumb in the Senate that it's harder to work with a senator of the same party than it is to work with a senator from the opposite party, because you have different networks, and you're not competing in the state. But I didn't work much with either Fowler or Coverdell staff.
So did your portfolio ever begin to include more foreign policy? The whole reason you.
Not a bit. No, that was all handled over at the committee, and just
Did you ever try to or think about angling for a committee staff assignment?
I really didn't. I didn't think that, first of all, that I would have probably couldn't have made it. Like it was these people were distinguished experts in their fields, arms control experts, nuclear weapons experts, procurement experts as far as the eye could see. And so I never had that expectation.
So, this whole, you came in 1987, and 1988, 1992, there's all this scuttlebutt at the national level that Senator Nunn is going to run for president. How much do you remember that conversation sort of percolating through the office and what that might mean for a young staffer?
Yeah, I think that that bubble had kind of mostly burst by that point. There wasn't much discussion internally that I was aware of. Whenever it came up, I think it must have come up in the presence of, I was present for another conversation with somebody else, I can't remember who, but somebody was asking, Sam, you ever going to run? And he said that he never had that experience of getting up in the morning, looking into the mirror and seeing a president in the mirror. And so he I think he thought about it really hard, never ran. I think he would have had a very difficult time getting the nomination.
That was the follow-up. Is I've talked to people, they think had he made it to the general election, he would have given George H.W. Bush, the vice president, a very tough race, but where the Democratic Party was in 1988 was probably the harder lift of trying to find that niche.
I think his contribution to that was really the establishment of the Democratic Leadership Council and helping to kind of pull the Democrats back into more, having a centrist voice in the party, which is what attracted me to working for him. And I think that strategy proved to be correct. So, I think that was his big foray into presidential politics, was the DLC.
Well, when did you and the staff learn that the senator wouldn't be seeking re-election in 90? So he was re-elected in 90,
right,
and would have been up for re-election in 96.
I remember that there was a poll conducted. This is after Charlie left, so it would have been under Bob's watch. But they did a poll, and Nunn's approval ratings were sky high. I mean, it was like, 60% approval. That's unheard of in Senate races. You just don't get, states, no senator gets that kind of approval anymore. And I remember Bob saying, if he were prime minister, we'd be calling for snap elections right now. And he kept making these feints of, well, maybe I'll, but I think that was mostly to keep people guessing, so that his authority, his ability to influence what was happening in the Senate didn't evaporate as soon as he said he wasn't running again.
Right. Avoiding lame duck.
Avoiding that as long as he could. But I can't remember exactly when it was. I remember it was down at the Georgia State Capitol where he made that announcement. I think it was John Fund, the Wall Street Journal guy, asked him what his most important accomplishment was, and he said, helping my wife Colleen, raise 2 wonderful children. And Fund said, "Oh, don't give me that soundbite stuff. Tell me what your most important senatorial achievement was." And I just kept walking.
Well, what did that mean for you as a staffer, that your boss was retiring? So how does the machinery start turning for somebody who's been on staff a very long time in the context of the U.S. Senate?
Yeah. Well, it was sad, and it was difficult. I remember going in to tell him that I wasn't, that I was moving on to work for Senator Coates, and I could tell he was upset. But I don't think it was like me that he was upset about. It was just like this feeling of people leaving. Of there's so much work left to do. why are people leaving? I mean, I'm trying to guess at what was in his head, but he seemed not happy with it, and just said, "I wish you were running. You know, I wish you were running again."
You came out and said it.
Yeah, I wish you were running again. I would stay. And he said, I'm not sorry. I'm not running." That's what I remember. And that was sort of it for the conversation. But yeah. So that kind of brings us to, like what was, kind of the impact of working for him. Now that I'm older than he was when I was working for him, perspective is pretty clear, that this was a guy who really taught me what it was to work in public policy, and to do it well, and to have high standards, to really care about what I was working on, to feel that sense of being as part of a team that was supporting somebody who was doing really serious work, and it shaped everything that came after. I don't know where else I could have gotten the training that I got working for him.
Tell me about how, you said that, how it set you on your career path and what you learned. How did you apply what you had learned in different Senate offices, Senator Coates, Senator Brownback, and then into the executive branch, which is a whole different beast entirely than the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thoroughness that I learned from him, of really grappling with details of not being satisfied with sound bites, but understanding the substance of what I was doing, you just can't replace that in terms of a shaping factor for life working in policy. And yeah, so Senator Coates was a very different experience. He was a different member. He was not nearly as interested in the details, and it was that was a really abrupt shift to and just tell me what to say and I'll say it. Now he didn't always do that, but for the most part he was happy to use what you gave him. Senator Nutt never did that. It was like, give me the briefing book. I'm going to go through this. I wrote him a briefing book one time. It was probably 50 or 60 pages of stuff. And I got it back, and it was all marked up. Marginal notes, underlines, questions. He actually sat and read the thing. And that's very, very unusual. I mean, especially considering how much that guy had to do, right? Mm-hmm. He had the U.S. military to look after, and I'm writing him memos on healthcare, and he's still finding the time somehow to get through the stuff. So that was another example, a positive example of taking the work seriously.
How did your experience working in the Senate prepare you for working in the executive branch and liaising with the legislative branch, being on the other side?
So I was on the Hill for 7 years, I think. I'm sorry. So it was half of my career was on my federal career was on Capitol Hill, so that would have been 11 years on Capitol Hill. I was a total Hill snob, right? I thought I was destined. I was a lifer. I was going to be up there forever. And I always had kind of a disdain for what was going on in the executive branch. It's like, it's not interesting. It's not important. All the interesting stuff is happening here in Congress. And then I got to the executive branch, and in my eyes, the scales fell from my eyes about what actually happens after Congress writes, passes a bill, and the president signs it. So there are thousands of civil servants responsible for implementing that policy. You know, it could be a paragraph that long that turns into a $30 million program that you're responsible then for designing, implementing, evaluating. So that was, the preparation of being very thorough was extremely useful, but I had no perspective on what the executive branch was like when I got there.
And a Jeffersonian conversion.
Yeah.
Well, you know, that takes us up to today, and there's more than a tinge of nostalgia in a lot of these oral history interviews about what the Senate was and how the Senate operated vis-a-vis the executive branch, or just in isolation. You know, with your perspective, as somebody who's worked in the executive, in the legislative branch here at AEI, compare and contrast today's legislature, today's Senate, today's executive branch, and how that differs from not all that long ago.
Well, I'm quite a few years gone from it, and I don't think the Hill is really the same place that it was when I was there. When I was working for Senator Nunn, there was a large cohort of moderates on both sides of the aisle who kind of controlled what got done in the Senate. It wasn't the people on the left and right wings of the Senate, but it was these members in the middle. You know, Nunn, Domenici was a very close friend, Mark Hatfield, Nancy Caspon, David Pryor, Dale Bumpers from Arkansas. There were a lot of Southern Democrats still at that point. Hal Heflin, Shelby was a Democrat at that point. And there were a lot of Southern Democrats, and nothing got through the Senate. You know, it was very hard to override those moderates. And that was ballast that kept things moving, or kept things steady in the Senate, I should say. And that's, I think, gone. I mean, there's so few moderates now. You can kind of count them, you know, on one hand, or maybe less. And even if there are people whose instincts are kind of are moderate, the politics are so polarized that it's really difficult to sustain those positions.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you think, you know, the senators from Maine, for example, Angus King, who's technically an independent, Susan Collins, who would be on the left of her party, still very reliable Republican vote. Yeah, on anything that seems to be needs pass. Yeah, that needs pass, that the president wants. So I think it's a very different place. But like I said, I've been away from it for a really long time. Well, one of the things that folks always look back fondly with their time with Senator Nunn is the rec league softball team. None better. Now, did you play? I was notorious for not playing. Oh. Yeah, which was a risk on my part as the Oregonian on the staff, you know, to say no, I don't like softball, I'm not playing. And every week, you know, like come on, just come out and just hang out with us. And I was like, nope, you're not getting me out there. And that actually points to one of the things that I loved and appreciated so much about Nunn's staff, which was it really did feel like being part of a family. We did a lot together outside of the office. We did meals, you know, we would have potlucks. You know, during the recess weeks, we'd have these potlucks. Everybody would bring stuff. There was a real sense of
camaraderie, mutual respect, affection, I think, between most of the staff. And it was just an amazing, from that standpoint, I've never had another experience like it.
What would you tell, one of the things that we like to do with these interviews is folks who are in applied politics, political science, who are Delta Hall, interning here on the Hill, a couple of them here at AEI. What advice would you give young people, not so young people, if they're thinking about interning on the Hill, going to the Hill to work, or just government service more broadly?
So my policy work here is around jobs and workforce development. I teach a class to undergrads called More Than a Paycheck. I don't focus so much on the economic aspects of work, which I think everybody gets, right?
Sure.
But trying to draw people's attention to the non-economic aspects of work and how important they are for building a happy career. I've had a very good and happy career because I've gotten to do things that I loved doing. It was not work. I have a podcast. We've wound it down, but podcast is hardly working, and it's really about how do you find that niche in the workforce where 10 years after you start doing it, you're still enjoying it. Because if you're not enjoying it after 10 years, you're really stuck. It's hard to make a change at that point. And that was, I would say that was one of the main learnings that I derived from working for Senator Nunn in that office, was just like, there has to be a passion in it in order for people to be happy. And because I've followed that thread through my career, it's been a very happy one.
So tell me a little bit more about this work that you are doing. For everybody who's in college and higher education, the disruptions. We're being disrupted every day by a new disruption, either technological or in the workforce, or the quest towards efficiency. What does that mean for people leaving college, entering the workforce? I know that's a big question, but what's your top
it's something that I think about a lot, which is that Americans take a pragmatic, I think an overly pragmatic view of work. It's like, show me the connection between the job and the economic outcome, and that's all that we want to hear about. And every college student who's ever gone home for Thanksgiving with their psychology major and been questioned, what are you going to do with that?
Or history PhD.
Or your history PhD or your history major. I mean, it's like unless it's, again, that you can see where the credential goes, where it slots into the economy, then it's not worth doing. And I think that is exactly the opposite way to I think it's exactly the wrong way to think about it, which is, again, if you want something sustainable, you got to find something that you both love and will pay the bills. You can't ignore that. So, getting to your disruption question, I think one of the things that we're learning right now is that the narrower the credential is, whether it's a certificate or a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, the narrower it is, the more brittle it is. The more subject it is to automation, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence. And so that creates a challenge. So what do I do about that? How do I prepare myself for a workforce in which the jobs are changing so rapidly? And this is the example, is like, for a decade or more, we've been telling people to learn how to code.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah. learn how to code. And now we've got a depression among coders who can't, front-end coders in particular, who are having trouble finding work because
the threat
AI.
charts are staggering.
Yeah, and AI is doing all of that front-end work, and so there's still a lot of demand, but you have to have like 10 or 15 years of experience in order to get the jobs that are open, and that's going to create its own challenges because where's the on-ramp
Right.
for these jobs? Anyway, that's only the beginning of what's happening. Technical writing is going to be deeply challenged by this. For people who are really, really skilled in these areas, there's going to be work to do. But for people who are sort of moderately skilled, it's going to be hard. And so what I tell people is you need to have a balanced skill portfolio, or educational and skill portfolio. If you're really good in STEM, pick up some humanities and social sciences. If you are really good in the humanities and social sciences, get some STEM under your belt, because all of those domains help you to think in very distinct ways, right?
Right.
The way a historian thinks is very different than the way that a chemist thinks. They're both valuable.
Sure.
Right? And so we all need both of those things. So what does both of those things get you? Well, it gets you the ability to pivot when the skills shift, right? Because you've got more than one tool in your belt. I also think it's just a lot more fun to have that broader education. I think it contributes to something called non-cognitive or soft skills that are also vital to success in the workplace. So
stop me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but you sound like you're a very strong advocate for a liberal arts education.
I do like the liberal arts. I've written some on this, and I think that for my career, it was instrumental in being able to do policy work again, because you have to synthesize a lot of information, and that's the skill that underlies the content.
Right.
Right.
The higher level, synthesis, analysis,
Yeah.
being able to, as Charlie would say, you need to be able to write clearly.
Yeah.
You have to be able to
Yeah.
explain yourself.
Yeah. Now, I think, even that, AI is changing things.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've spent my entire career trying to become a better writer, and learned a lot about writing clearly for Senator Dunn, because he knew clear from unclear. I helped with his... He spoke to the National Prayer Breakfast, and I was one of 3 people who kind of helped him write that speech. And I remember sitting with him, and he had the legal pads, and he was always writing on these legal pads. And I said to Exon Neesmith, who you unfortunately probably didn't get to interview.
No.
Before she passed, but I said it's really amazing the way he kind of holds the entire speech in his brain. Like, he knows the whole speech, and he knows the sections of the speech. And she said it's because he outlines everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so the outline is there, and that's what he's working from. So going back to writing, I spent 30 years doing this. I think that people coming up now have this incredible advantage of being able to use AI to accelerate their careers if they want to be writers. You still have to do the hard work of learning how to write, but you can really write so much better with the aid of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Right. You still have to know what's good from bad by
Yeah.
looking at it and saying, that sounds terrible.
Yeah.
And how to tweak it, and
Yeah.
how to prompt it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives you're getting continuous feedback, which is really how you get better at writing.
Yeah.
So,
I know, I don't envy the professors and the teaching assistants, in the survey level, but.
I had a law school professor the other day, not the other day, but not long ago, say, it takes 20 hours to write a 10-page paper for his class. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
And he said, now, if you use AI and you put the 20 hours in, he said the papers are the best that he's ever seen. And this guy, I work with him. He's one of the best writers I've ever seen. But he said, it is radically improving people at the top end, right? If you just use the AI and let it do all the work for you, it's sort of meh. It's not very interesting. It's certainly passable, but it's not excellent. So it's the combination of the technology with the human effort, I think, that really makes it sane.
It's refreshing to hear somebody's take on AI, coming from a perspective of a champion for education and liberal arts education, not being a doomsayer. The sky is falling, because it definitely seems like you're in the technocratic camp of the AI will do everything for us. People can step aside, or this is Skynet. This is the end of the.
Yeah, Hollywood has really conditioned us to fear it. But I think it's an incredible tool. I'm very hopeful about the benefits that it's going to deliver. And I think that some of the best preparation for using it is a liberal arts education.
Brent, I think that's a fantastic place to leave it as a graduate of a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your afternoon to talk about your work with Senator Nunn and your memories working for him and on Capitol Hill.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely,
you so
my
much.
pleasure. Bye, Senator Nunn.